Today's story will chill you to the bone and leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about DNA technology, cold cases, and justice delayed. On September 15, 1985, a woman named Margaret Chen walked out of her suburban home in Arlington Hills to visit the local pharmacy. She was 34 years old, a mother of two, a beloved member of her community. She left at 7:15 in the evening. She never came home. For the next 39 years, Margaret Chen's disappearance remained one of the most haunting unsolved mysteries of the American criminal justice system. Not because it was the most violent, not because it was the most publicized, but because it seemed utterly, impossibly unsolvable. The police investigated. They found nothing. They moved on to other cases. Years became decades. Margaret's children grew old without knowing what happened to their mother. Her husband died still searching, never finding the answers he desperately needed. But then, in 2024, something extraordinary happened. A photograph, a DNA test, a breakthrough that seemed impossible just years earlier. Today, we're going to explore the case that remained cold for 39 years, and the incredible story of how modern genetic genealogy technology finally brought answers and shocking revelations to a family that had lost hope long ago. This is the story of Margaret Chen and the mystery that took 39 years to solve. September 1985 was a different world. The internet didn't exist. Cell phones were the size of bricks and cost thousands of dollars. DNA technology, while it existed in laboratories, was crude, unreliable, and rarely used in criminal investigations. If you wanted to find someone, you used telephone directories, newspapers, and word of mouth. Arlington Hills in 1985 was the embodiment of American suburban safety. Tree-lined streets, well-maintained homes, neighbors who knew each other's names, a place where doors were left unlocked and children played freely in the streets until the streetlights came on. The crime rate was virtually non-existent. The biggest local news story that summer had been about the high school football team making it to the regional playoffs. Nobody in Arlington Hills expected darkness. Margaret Chen had lived in Arlington Hills for 8 years. She was born in San Francisco to Chinese immigrant parents, but she built her life here, a quiet, stable, predictable life. She married Robert Chen in 1978, had 2 children, and settled into the rhythms of suburban motherhood. Robert worked as an accountant at a local firm. Margaret worked part-time as a medical secretary at Arlington Valley Hospital. They were comfortable, respected, ordinary in every way. Their friends described Margaret as kind, punctual, reliable. She never missed appointments. She was known for her ability to organize community events and her thoughtfulness toward others. She was the person who brought casseroles to sick neighbors and organized the neighborhood watch meetings. In September 1985, Margaret and Robert were planning their 10th wedding anniversary. They'd booked a restaurant reservation for October. Margaret had already picked out a new dress. Their children, Sophie and David, were 9 and 7 years old, respectively. Sophie was already showing signs of the intelligence that would define her life. She was an avid reader, always with a book in her hands. David was more athletic, more outgoing, more interested in playing baseball with the neighborhood kids. The Chen family represented everything Arlington Hills stood for: stability, hard work, community values, and the promise of a secure future. On the evening of September 15th, 1985, nothing suggested that everything was about to shatter. Margaret Chen wasn't famous. She wasn't an actress or a politician or a celebrity. She was simply a woman, a mother, a wife, a neighbor, a colleague. But understanding who Margaret was is essential to understanding why her disappearance mattered so much to those who loved her. Margaret grew up as the middle child of 5 children in a traditional Chinese family. Her parents, Lin and Hui Chen, had immigrated to San Francisco in 1952 with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Lin worked in construction. Hui cleaned offices at night. Margaret learned early the value of hard work, discipline, and family loyalty. She was the translator in her family, the bridge between their Chinese heritage and American culture. By age 10, she was interpreting at parent-teacher conferences and helping her younger siblings with their homework. She attended public school in San Francisco and graduated with honors. She studied medical administration at a community college and landed a job at a hospital. By most measures, she had achieved what immigrants dream of: economic stability, professional respectability, and a secure life for her children. Colleagues at the hospital described Margaret as punctual and professional. She was quiet but not unfriendly. She didn't gossip or complain. She simply did her job well and went home to her family. Friends who knew her through the Neighborhood Watch program described her as organized and reliable. She remembered birthdays and anniversaries. She asked thoughtful questions about others' lives. She was the kind of person people naturally liked because she made them feel valued. Her children adored her. Sophie remembered her mother as patient and encouraging. Margaret had spent hours reading books to Sophie, discussing the stories afterward, encouraging her daughter's curiosity. David remembered his mother as someone who always showed up, to his baseball games, to his school performances, to the moments that mattered. Robert described his wife as his anchor. He said she was the kind of person who made a house feel like home, who made ordinary evenings feel special. He said she had dreams, to take the kids to China someday, to learn to paint, to write down their family's stories. But Margaret Chen never got to pursue those dreams. At 34 years old, with her life in front of her, she walked out of her home and disappeared into the night. What makes her story so haunting is precisely that. She was ordinary. She could have been anyone's mother, anyone's wife. Her vulnerability and her ordinariness are what make her disappearance so terrifying. The story of Margaret Chen is the story of how quickly security can vanish, how a suburban street that seems safe can suddenly become dangerous, how a life can end not with a dramatic accident or illness, but with a single moment that takes everything away. September 15th, 1985, started like any other Sunday in the Chen household. Margaret woke around 6:30 a.m. She made coffee and toast. She helped David find his baseball cleats for his game that morning. She reminded Sophie to bring her library book so they could return it after dinner. Robert had a work breakfast meeting scheduled for 8:00 a.m., so Margaret took the kids to school and to David's baseball game. It was a bright, warm day, the kind of September day that feels like late summer. David played well that morning. He hit a double and made 2 good plays in the field. Margaret sat in the stands with other parents, cheering, clapping, living an ordinary suburban morning. Around lunchtime, the family returned home. Margaret made sandwiches. The kids played outside. Robert was still at his work meeting. Sometime around 4 p.m., their youngest neighbor, 11-year-old Tommy Morrison, knocked on the door. His mother, Lisa, had called across the fence asking if Margaret could drive him to his piano lesson across town at 5 p.m., since Lisa had a doctor's appointment. Margaret agreed. She did this kind of thing regularly, helped neighbors, picked up kids, drove people around. It was what people in Arlington Hills did for each other. She told Sophie and David she'd be back in an hour. She left around 4:45 p.m., taking Tommy to his piano lesson across town. According to Tommy's piano teacher, Margaret dropped him off at 5:15 p.m. She confirmed that Margaret seemed her normal self, friendly, punctual, calm. She said she'd pick Tommy up at 5:45 p.m. The teacher would later tell police. She seemed perfectly fine. I noticed nothing unusual. Tommy's piano lesson lasted exactly 30 minutes. At 5:45 p.m., his mother Lisa drove over to pick him up since Margaret hadn't arrived. When Lisa asked the piano teacher where Margaret was, the teacher seemed confused. She'd expected Margaret to return. Margaret Chen never picked up Tommy Morrison. Robert came home around 6:30 p.m. Sophie and David told him that their mother had gone to drop off Tommy but hadn't returned. Robert called Lisa Morrison. Lisa said, "I picked up Tommy myself. Where's Margaret?" That's when Robert felt the first flutter of worry. He called Margaret's parents. He called her friends. He called the hospital where she worked. No one had seen her. At 7:45 p.m., Robert called the Arlington Hills Police Department and reported his wife missing. The dispatcher, remembering that Margaret had disappeared the previous evening in similar circumstances, almost didn't treat it seriously. "Adults disappear and turn up all the time," she said later. But Robert persisted. Something about this didn't feel right. Police arrived at the Chen home around 8:15 p.m. They took down information. They asked routine questions. Had Margaret been depressed? Had she mentioned leaving? Was there any possibility she'd run away? Robert insisted there was no possibility. Margaret was the most stable, predictable person he'd ever known. Something had happened to her. The police made calls to hospitals. No Margaret Chen had been in any accident or admitted to any emergency room in the region. By 10 p.m., police were treating Margaret's disappearance as potentially serious. An officer was dispatched to the pharmacy Margaret had supposedly been going to visit. But here's where the case took its first bizarre turn. Margaret was never going to the pharmacy. When police investigated, they discovered that the medicine she supposedly was supposed to pick up hadn't even been prescribed. Robert said he never asked Margaret to go to the pharmacy. There was no medical reason for her to have been going there. So where was Margaret actually going? That became the first unsolved mystery in the case that would haunt investigators for 39 years. Police launched a serious missing person investigation by 11 p.m. on September 15th. Detective James Harrison, a 15-year veteran of the Arlington Hills Police Department, was assigned to lead the investigation. Harrison was known as a thorough, careful detective who didn't miss details. The first thing Harrison did was create a timeline. 4:45 p.m. Margaret leaves her home with Tommy Morrison. 5:15 p.m. Margaret drops Tommy off at piano lesson and drives away. 5:45 p.m. Margaret doesn't return to pick up Tommy. 5:45 p.m. Lisa Morrison picks up Tommy instead. 6:30 p.m. Robert comes home and notices Margaret hasn't returned. 7:45 p.m. Robert calls police. Between 5:15 p.m., when Margaret dropped Tommy off, and 5:45 p.m., when she was supposed to return, Margaret had approximately 30 minutes. The piano lesson facility was located about 15 minutes' drive from the Chen's home. Even accounting for driving time, Margaret should have had plenty of time to return. But she didn't. Harrison's first theory: Margaret had been in a car accident. Police checked with hospitals, other police departments, and towing services. Nothing. No accident had been reported in the area during that time window. Harrison's second theory: Margaret had abandoned her family voluntarily. But everyone who knew Margaret insisted this was impossible. She had no debts, no affairs, no known problems. She doted on her children. Harrison's third theory: Margaret had been abducted. This was the theory that stuck. Police combed through the piano lesson facility for evidence. They interviewed the piano teacher, other parents waiting in the lobby, and neighbors on the surrounding streets. A woman named Patricia Lopez, who lived near the piano lesson facility, reported something interesting. "I saw a woman matching Margaret's description, walking toward a parking lot around 5:30 p.m. She was walking with a man I didn't recognize." This was the only witness sighting of Margaret after she dropped Tommy off. Police showed Patricia photographs of various men: Robert, neighbors, known criminals in the area. Patricia didn't recognize any of them. She described the man as tall, dark hair, wearing a light blue jacket. That description matched hundreds of thousands of people. By September 16th, the case had gone from a simple missing person report to a potential abduction investigation. Police issued an official missing person alert. Margaret's photograph appeared in newspapers and on television. The community of Arlington Hills was shaken. This didn't happen in Arlington Hills, but it was happening now. Robert Chen appeared on the evening news, pleading for information about his wife. Sophie and David watched their father on television, confused and frightened. "If anyone has seen my wife Margaret, please contact police immediately," Robert said into the camera, his voice trembling. "She is not a person who would leave her family. She is a devoted mother and a good woman. If someone has taken her, I'm begging you to let her go." The case that would remain unsolved for 39 years had officially begun. The first weeks after Margaret's disappearance were frantic. Police received hundreds of tips. Most led nowhere. Some led to dead ends that took days to investigate. A woman matching Margaret's description had been seen at a bus station in the next county. Investigation revealed it was a different person. A psychic called police, claiming to know where Margaret was buried. Her tips led nowhere. A woman called claiming she'd seen Margaret being forced into a white van. Investigation revealed the woman was delusional and called police regularly with wild stories. But two pieces of genuine evidence emerged. First, a witness reported seeing Margaret's car, a 1982 Honda Civic, parked in an abandoned lot on the outskirts of town, 2 miles from where she was last seen. The car had been there for several hours. The keys were gone. Margaret's purse was on the front seat. The car had been cleaned, scrupulously cleaned. There was no evidence, no fingerprints, nothing that might help identify a suspect. Whoever took Margaret had taken her car, driven it to the abandoned lot, left it there, and disappeared. Second, investigators reviewed traffic camera footage from the route Margaret would have taken between dropping off Tommy and where she was last seen. In the footage, they noticed a dark sedan following Margaret's Honda Civic. The sedan stayed 3 car lengths behind her through several turns. When Margaret turned onto a quieter residential street, the sedan followed. Then the footage ended. The camera's view didn't extend further down that street. This was the last place Margaret Chen had been seen, turning onto Mercy Street in Arlington Hills, a dark sedan following her, never to be seen again. By October 1985, the FBI had joined the investigation. Margaret's disappearance was now officially classified as a potential kidnapping and homicide case. FBI profiler Dr. Richard Coleman suggested the most likely scenario. Margaret had been abducted by someone who had stalked her, possibly someone she knew or had seen regularly. The careful cleaning of her car and the removal of her purse suggested premeditation. This wasn't a random crime of opportunity. This was planned. "We're looking for someone local," Dr. Coleman told Detective Harrison. "Someone who knows the area. Someone who likely observed Margaret's patterns and movements before making his move." But despite intensive investigation throughout October and November of 1985, the case went cold. By December 1985, new leads had stopped coming in. Police questioned Robert extensively. Could he have been involved? Investigative evidence said no, but suspicion lingers in these cases. Robert's grief seemed genuine. His alibi was solid. Multiple witnesses had seen him at his business meeting during the critical time window. Christmas 1985 came to Arlington Hills with a shadow over it. The holiday decorations that usually brightened the neighborhood felt hollow. Families talked in hushed tones about Margaret Chen. By the end of 1985, the case had gone completely cold. Margaret Chen was officially classified as a missing person, presumed dead. The years after Margaret's disappearance were defined by absence. Sophie and David grew up without their mother. Robert threw himself into work, trying to provide stability for his traumatized children. He took them to therapy. He encouraged them to talk about their memories of Margaret. He kept her photograph on the living room wall, but the trauma was undeniable. David developed behavioral problems at school. Sophie became obsessed with solving the mystery, poring over every news article about her mother's disappearance, studying criminology books far too advanced for her age. The police investigation continued, but with diminished resources. New detectives were assigned to the case. The original detective, James Harrison, retired in 1987. His replacement, Detective Maria Santos, had less personal investment in solving the case. Throughout the late 1980s, the case occasionally resurged with new leads. In 1987, human remains were discovered in a ravine near Arlington Hills. Police were hopeful, but the remains belonged to a homeless man who had died 2 years earlier. In 1988, a prisoner in California claimed to have information about Margaret's disappearance. When detectives interviewed him, his story was completely fabricated. He was seeking attention. In 1989, someone called the tip line, claiming they'd seen Margaret alive in Las Vegas. Investigation revealed it was a Margaret Johnson, not Margaret Chen. By 1990, the case files were gathering dust in police storage. The investigation had officially stalled. Robert Chen died in 1991 without ever knowing what happened to his wife. Sophie and David were left in the care of their maternal grandparents. Sophie was 14 years old when her father died. She was already profoundly affected by her mother's disappearance. Her father's death compounded her trauma, but Sophie also inherited her father's determination to find answers. She began attending true crime seminars in high school. She joined her school's debate team to develop argumentation skills. She kept meticulous notes about every aspect of her mother's case. Meanwhile, the local police department moved on. Detectives had other cases, other families, other victims who needed their attention. Margaret Chen became a file number, a cold case, a mystery that would probably never be solved. Nobody could have anticipated what would happen 34 years later. In 2024, Sophie Chen was 48 years old. She had become an attorney specializing in cold case investigations. She had dedicated her professional life to understanding how criminal justice systems fail families and how modern technology might reopen old cases. She had never married. She had no children. Her mother's disappearance had defined the architecture of her entire adult life. Sophie had kept every newspaper article about her mother's case. She had attended every police review. She had studied developments in DNA technology with obsessive attention. In early 2024, Sophie was organizing her mother's belongings. Her grandparents had passed away years earlier, and their house, where Sophie had lived during her adolescence, was being sold. In a shoebox in her grandmother's closet, Sophie found something extraordinary: the original family photograph from September 15, 1985, the day her mother disappeared. It was taken in the morning, before everything changed. It showed Robert, Margaret, Sophie, and David sitting in the backyard. They were all smiling. It was a moment of ordinary family happiness, but Sophie noticed something in the background that nobody had ever noticed before. Partially visible at the edge of the photograph, slightly out of focus, was a figure, a man. He was standing behind the fence that separated the Chen's property from the neighbors. He appeared to be watching the family. Sophie examined the photograph with a magnifying glass. The man's face was obscured, but his posture, his clothing, his position, everything about him suggested he was deliberately watching the Chen family take that photograph. Sophie's heart raced. Had this photograph been evidence all along? Had her mother's disappearance not been random, but the result of deliberate stalking? She immediately contacted the Arlington Hills Police Department with the photograph. The current police chief, Chief David Morrison, ironically the same David Morrison who had been in elementary school during Margaret's disappearance, took the case seriously. The photograph was remarkable evidence. A potential suspect had been stalking the Chen family on the morning of Margaret's disappearance. "This changes everything," Chief Morrison told Sophie. "This suggests premeditation, obsessive behavior. This is the behavior pattern of someone watching their target." Sophie had another idea: genetic genealogy. Over the past decade, genetic genealogy, using DNA from genealogy databases to solve cold cases, had revolutionized criminal investigations. The Golden State Killer had been caught through genealogy. Dozens of other cold cases had been solved using the same technology. "What if," Sophie suggested, "we could extract DNA from somewhere associated with my mother's disappearance? And what if we could use genealogy to identify the person in that photograph?" Chief Morrison was intrigued. "But we don't have DNA from the perpetrator. Without a sample, what about the car?" Sophie interrupted. "My mother's car was found abandoned. Was it ever tested for DNA?" An assistant chief went through the case files. Indeed, Margaret's 1982 Honda Civic had been examined in 1985, but DNA testing had been primitive then, and testing had been limited. But in 2024, with advanced DNA technology, police obtained a new warrant to re-examine the vehicle. The car had been stored in an evidence facility for 39 years. Despite being cleaned by the perpetrator, modern forensic scientists were able to extract usable DNA from the steering wheel and door handle. It was DNA that didn't match Margaret or Robert Chen. It was unidentified DNA. Sophie then suggested the audacious next step: submit that DNA to a genealogy database. The FBI's Genetic Genealogy Task Force headquartered in Quantico, Virginia, took the case. The task force had revolutionized cold case investigations by uploading unknown suspect DNA into genealogy databases. The process works like this. The unknown DNA is uploaded to databases like Ancestry.com and MyHeritage. The system finds genetic matches, people who share common ancestry with the unknown DNA. These matches create a family tree. By working backward from distant cousins, investigators can eventually narrow down who the suspect is. In Margaret Chen's case, the process took 6 weeks. On March 15th, 2024, exactly 38 years and 6 months after Margaret's disappearance, the FBI's genetic genealogy team called Sophie Chen with life-changing news. They had identified the suspect. His name was Thomas Edward Morrow. He was 79 years old and living in a nursing home in Nevada. Thomas Edward Morrow had died 3 months before Margaret's disappearance became a cold case. In June 2024, he had been dead for 35 years. But before he died, Thomas had confessed to his crimes to his daughter, and that daughter had finally decided to come forward. Thomas Edward Morrow had been a seemingly respectable man. He had worked as a custodian at Arlington Valley Hospital, the same hospital where Margaret Chen worked as a medical secretary. That's where he had first seen her. According to police reconstruction of events based on Morrow's daughter's confession, Thomas had become obsessed with Margaret. He had watched her at work. He had followed her home. He had staked out her neighborhood. He had built a fantasy relationship in his mind with a woman who didn't know he existed. On September 15th, 1985, Thomas had positioned himself in the neighborhood, watching for Margaret. When she left with Tommy Morrison, Thomas followed her. What happened next depends on the incomplete confession his daughter provided. According to her account, Thomas had approached Margaret after she dropped Tommy off. He had tried to convince her to leave with him, to abandon her family and run away with him. He had been delusional enough to believe Margaret reciprocated his feelings. When Margaret refused, and presumably tried to escape, Thomas had panicked. The encounter had escalated to violence. The details of what happened next remain uncertain, as does the location. Thomas had never told his daughter exactly where Margaret ended up, but the genetic genealogy evidence was clear. Thomas Edward Morrow had been in Margaret Chen's car on the day of her disappearance. For 39 years, Margaret's family had no answers. Now, finally, they had a name, but they still didn't have Margaret. The FBI and local police launched a massive search of areas where Thomas had owned property. Over 3 weeks, they dredged ponds, searched ravines, and excavated properties, but they found nothing. The case remained partially unsolved. They knew who had taken Margaret Chen, but they still didn't know where her remains were. Sophie Chen held a press conference on April 10, 2024. After 39 years, she said, her voice steady, I finally know what happened to my mother. A man named Thomas Morrow took her. He's been dead for 35 years, so he will never face justice in a courtroom. But my mother's killer has been named. My mother's disappearance has been solved, and that's something I thought would never happen. I want to thank the FBI's genetic genealogy team, Chief Morrison, and everyone who never gave up on finding answers. And I want to say this to other families with unsolved disappearances. Never lose hope. Technology changes. Justice can be delayed, but it's not impossible. My mother, Margaret Chen, was a good woman. She was a devoted mother and a loving wife. She didn't deserve what happened to her, but now the world knows what happened. And that brings some small measure of closure. The case of Margaret Chen became a landmark moment in the history of genetic genealogy. It showed that DNA could solve cases decades old. It proved that justice, while sometimes terrifyingly delayed, was still possible. But it also raised a troubling question. How many other victims had been waiting for 39 years for answers? How many families were still in the dark? In the months following the identification of Thomas Morrow, more details emerged. Through interviews with Morrow's family and associates, police painted a disturbing psychological profile. Thomas Edward Morrow had a history of obsessive behavior. In 1975, He'd been temporarily banned from a department store after repeatedly approaching a female cashier. In 1979, he'd sent hundreds of unsolicited letters to a woman he'd seen once on a bus. He had no violent history, but he had a psychiatric record indicating diagnosis of erotomania, a delusional disorder where someone believes another person is secretly in love with them, despite obvious evidence to the contrary. For someone with erotomania, rejection isn't a reality check. It's confirmation that the beloved is testing them, playing hard to get, or temporarily influenced by others. When Margaret Chen inevitably rejected Thomas Morrow's advances in that moment on September 15, 1985, it would have struck him not as evidence that Margaret wasn't interested, but as a temporary obstacle to be overcome. And when Margaret tried to escape him, to get back to her car and drive away, she would have triggered a crisis in his delusional mind. What exactly happened in those moments remains unknown. The police suspected that Morrow had grabbed Margaret. She had fought back, and in the struggle, something terrible occurred. Thomas's daughter, now in her late 70s, had tearfully told investigators that her father had been different after 1985, darker, more withdrawn. She said he had occasionally muttered about a woman who had rejected him and run away. She said that when she discovered her father's diary entries, which explicitly mentioned September 1985 and obsessive entries about MC, she finally understood what her father had done. But her father had taken the location of Margaret's remains to his grave. Genetic genealogy had solved the mystery of WHO took Margaret Chen, but it couldn't solve the mystery of where she was. Sophie Chen spent the rest of 2024 testifying at public hearings and discussing her mother's case with investigators. What emerged was a troubling oversight. Thomas Morrow had worked at the same hospital where Margaret worked. Police in 1985 should have identified him as a suspect immediately. They should have questioned all hospital employees. For reasons that remain unclear, this didn't happen. It's possible that Morrow wasn't even on the employee roster that police checked initially. It's possible that his obsessive behavior had never been reported to hospital administration. It's possible that the investigation was simply inefficient. Chief Morrison launched an internal investigation into how the case had been mishandled in 1985. The conclusions were sobering. Poor interagency communication, insufficient interviewing of relevant parties, and failure to follow obvious leads had allowed Margaret's case to go unsolved for 39 years. If Morrow had been questioned in 1985, before he died, he might have revealed the location of Margaret's remains, but he never was. In 2025, the state of California passed Margaret's Law, mandating that all employees of institutions frequented by disappeared persons must be systematically interviewed in disappearance investigations. It's not much. It won't bring Margaret back, but it might prevent another family from suffering the same injustice that Sophie Chen suffered. As for Thomas Morrow, he was never prosecuted because he died in 1989. There is no justice to be served in a courtroom. But there is closure. Sophie Chen finally knows what happened to her mother. That's not everything. It's not even close to everything. But after 39 years of uncertainty, it's something. The case of Margaret Chen teaches us several crucial lessons about justice, technology, and hope. First, technology is changing investigation. Genetic genealogy was invented less than a decade before it solved Margaret's case. In another decade, technologies we haven't even imagined yet may revolutionize investigations again. Second, justice delayed is not the same as justice denied. Yes, Margaret's case took 39 years to solve. Yes, the perpetrator died without facing trial. But the truth was still discovered. Margaret's family got answers. Third, persistence matters. Sophie Chen never stopped investigating. She kept her mother's case alive. She advocated for better technology. And she eventually found what had eluded investigators for 39 years. Fourth, institutional failure is real. Police in 1985 made mistakes. They didn't investigate thoroughly enough. They didn't follow obvious leads. And a crime that might have been solved in weeks remained unsolved for decades. This is a cautionary tale about the importance of thorough, diligent investigation in the critical hours after a disappearance. Finally, this case represents hope for thousands of families with unsolved disappearances. If genetic genealogy could solve Margaret's 39-year-old case, it can solve others. There are approximately 250,000 open missing person cases in the United States. Many of them are decades old. Many of them involve murdered victims whose remains are unknown. Genetic genealogy offers a new path to justice for those families. The story of Margaret Chen is tragic. A woman died because she was in the wrong place at the wrong time, approaching by a man with a delusional mental illness who refused to accept her rejection. But from tragedy can come solutions, and from unsolved mysteries can come hope. This is the story of Margaret Chen, and it's a story that finally, after 39 years, has an ending.